Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The British Constitution, a very short introduction, 2nd edition, by Martin Loughlin, narrated by Michael Langan. Preface. The purpose of this book is to explain the workings of the British Constitution by setting it in a broad historical context. Written over a decade ago, it was anticipated that it might stand the test of time. Subsequent events, however, have raised more profound questions of constitutional significance than during any other decade since the First World War. A new edition, considering these developments, seems necessary. The book was initially written during the early phase of the 2010-15 Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government, whose joint Programme for Government opened with the dramatic statement, "The government believes that our political system is broken." After promising a series of ambitious constitutional reforms, the achievements of the coalition government fell considerably short of expectation. There was no reform of the voting system, no equalisation of constituencies, no reform of the House of Lords, and no reform or repeal of the Human Rights Act. The Prime Minister's discretionary power to dissolve Parliament had been curbed by the Fixed Terms Parliament Act 2011, though it was not self-evident that this measure, designed to protect the junior partner, would improve the system of government. In 2019, it contributed to a breakdown in parliamentary arrangements and has since been repealed. The most significant innovation was to recognise the value of holding a referendum before proceeding with major reform, although in the event its most dramatic usage, the independence referendum held in Scotland in 2014, had been initiated by the Scottish Government and only reluctantly conceded by the coalition government. When the Conservatives were returned in 2015 with an overall majority, however, they quickly employed a referendum to gauge popular support for continued membership of the European Union. And it is the shock result of that exercise that initiated an unprecedented period of constitutional unsettlement that continues to reverberate today. Implementation of the Brexit referendum result caused a major upheaval in Britain's system of parliamentary government. This has been reflected in the breakdown of many conventions of constitutional government and a renewed pressure to convert informal practices into formal rules. But the depth of this unsettlement can also be measured by the fact that, despite continuous Conservative rule since 2015, the UK has had 4 different Prime Ministers, only one of whom took office by winning a general election, and, other than the present, 2023, incumbent, none of whom has been removed by defeat in a general election. In these unsettled conditions, it seemed as if the only thing holding together the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland was the continuing dignified presence of Queen Elizabeth II. Her death in September 2022, after 70 years on the throne, now signifies the passing of an era that, from a constitutional perspective, has marked the progressive decline in governmental authority. But the future is not my subject. The purpose of this new edition is to bring the story of Britain's constitutional development up to date. In completing it, I am indebted to Pravar Petkar for research assistance and to Chris Foley for having helped to make it more readable. Chapter 1. The Existential Question. Is there a British Constitution? Once extolled as a standing wonder, the British Constitution today evokes bewilderment and even derision. Many now find the idea of a constitution that has grown organically simply puzzling. A century ago, the historian Sidney Lowe claimed that we live under a system of tacit understandings, though these are not always understood. Today, the problem is not confined to grasping the meaning of these tacit constitutional understandings. The question is whether they still exist. The British clearly have a system of government, a set of rules regulating the exercise of political power. But the idea of a constitution connotes something more. It suggests that institutions of government are infused with values and modes of conduct that fix the meaning of those rules and express a distinct way of organizing political life. Do such values and practices still exist? Do they still command authority? It is in this deeper sense that we ask whether there is still such a thing as a British Constitution. There is every reason to answer that question affirmatively, not least because this book would otherwise rank as the shortest of all very short introductions. But the evidence of the last 5 decades is not reassuring. Since the 1970s, from across the political spectrum, there has been growing dissatisfaction with constitutional arrangements. Consider Lord Hailsham's celebrated 1976 Dimbleby lecture on elective dictatorship. Opening with the paradox that government had never before possessed so much power and commanded so little respect, he noted that there was scarcely an institution of government that did not come in for serious criticism. For Hailsham, this was because these institutions were no longer performing their constitutional role of providing a balance. The monarchy had been reduced to an entirely ceremonial function. The House of Lords no longer acted as a restraining influence, and political conduct was determined by party political interest rather than any sense of constitutionally appropriate behavior. Customary constitutional restraints were no longer working, and traditions of civility from which these constitutional values have evolved were losing authority. The only solution, Hailsham concluded, was to devise an entirely new constitution, which, like all new constitutions, must be written down and defined by law. Hailsham was hardly a radical. Son of a viscount, educated at Eton and Oxford, after practising at the bar, he had a successful career as a Conservative MP and minister. And once the Conservatives were returned to office in 1979, Hailsham, now Lord Chancellor, quietly shelved his proposal. Restructuring government became more important than reforming the Constitution. Hailsham's theme was quickly taken up by a breakaway Labour group, who, in 1981, founded a new party. At the heart of the programme of the Social Democratic Party was a proposal for fundamental constitutional reform, elaborated by David Marquand in The Unprincipled Society, 1988. Marquand argued that Britain's problems, economic as well as political, stemmed from the failure of its political class to shed a Victorian constitutional mentality. Whereas Hailsham had proposed a modern constitution to protect the Victorian values that Conservatives hold dear, Marquand was criticising their pervasive influence. The problem, he contended, is that we are living in a society in which property is an antecedent right, liberty is realised when we are left alone, and government is best left in the hands of an experienced political elite, conscious of its obligations to society. The past genius of the traditional constitution has become the source of our present weakness. The British problem, he concluded, was one of maladaptation. Fundamental constitutional reform was needed so that modern ideas of democracy and citizenship rights could flourish. Marquand's message was later adopted by the 1990s Labour Party, which, reformed and rebranded as New Labour, won the 1997 election on a platform of constitutional modernisation. It quickly introduced new measures of constitutional significance. Governmental power was devolved to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. The House of Lords was reformed, and innovations such as the Human Rights Act and the Freedom of Information Act were adopted. This was the most radical set of constitutional reforms promoted by any government since the First World War. These reforms, nevertheless, provoked unsettling questions. Wasn't this package rather makeshift? Was the new constitutional settlement coherent? Didn't these reforms leave untouched the exercise of power at the centre? Did the programme not, in fact, demonstrate the impossibility of governments themselves reordering constitutional fundamentals? Political analyst Will Hutton had already indicated the difficulties. In The State We're In, 1995, he explained how economic and political changes since the 1970s had eroded the public service ethos that bolstered traditional arrangements. But he has also recognised that the sort of fundamental constitutional reform now required had never before been achieved by any nation without the utter collapse of its system of government. The European Venture. By the 21st century, there seemed to be a broad-based consensus that Britain's inherited constitution had come to the end of its useful life. Constitutional reform had secured a prominent but highly ambivalent place on the agendas of all major political parties. But there was one dimension of recent developments that had been overlooked. The most powerful driving force of constitutional modernization over the last several decades has been the United Kingdom's participation in the venture of continuing European integration. This involvement has empowered the judiciary to extend rights-based methods of review, meaning that the British have adopted what is, in effect, a Bill of Rights without the need for extensive public deliberation. It has also helped set in place a dynamic scheme for devolving governmental powers to the constituent nations of the UK, as well as bolstering the unique cross-border arrangements that brought about a peace settlement in Northern Ireland. Continuing European integration has enabled governing arrangements to be reconfigured and constitutional fundamentals reordered so as to bring the UK into closer alignment with the framework of modern constitutional democracies. The European aspect reveals the depth of the contemporary crisis of constitutional practice. The UK's 2016 referendum decision to withdraw from the European Union has led to a protracted period of unsettlement, the constitutional implications of which did not end on 31st of January 2020, when the UK formally left the EU. These broad-reaching repercussions flow from the fact that European integration has been fostered not only by membership of the EU, but also by adherence, through membership of the Council of Europe, to the European Convention on Human Rights. The impact of these current developments means that interest in constitutional questions has never been greater, and their uncertainty never deeper. Recent reforms initiated by both domestic and European developments have led to the codification of many of the rules. In this sense, the British are closer than ever to having a written constitution. At the same time, however, the common values this rule system is supposed to uphold have become increasingly unclear. It is in this sense that the existential question, does Britain possess a constitution, remains real. One important initial task must be to consider how the present predicament was reached. This book, therefore, begins by outlining the basic features of the traditional constitution and explaining how it survived into the modern world. Why, when all other nations were adopting formal documentary statements of their constitutional arrangements, did the British maintain these traditional arrangements? In later chapters, I examined the tensions that emerge in trying to operate in a world of modern government with a heritage of traditional constitutional forms, and consider how scholars have addressed the challenge of writing about the unwritten constitution. I will also explain how the constitution changes once the English state is transformed into the British state, then acquires and subsequently loses an empire. And I will examine the implications of the UK's integration into, and subsequent exit from, the European Union. Chapter 2. What Constitution? The British are almost unique in not having a written constitution. What does this mean? It cannot mean that governing arrangements are not laid down in writing. If the Constitution is defined as the rules that establish and regulate the institutions of government, then the British do have a set of such rules. The unusual feature of the British Constitution is only that these rules have not been gathered together in a document called the Constitution. Is this the deficiency contemporary reformers seek to remedy? Is constitutional modernization driven by the desire to systematize these rules and present them in a single document? That would be an oversimplification. The difficulties touch on more fundamental questions. During the 18th century, the British were fated for having the matchless constitution, one that managed to combine the virtues of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy while avoiding their characteristic vices. And throughout the 19th century, the Constitution was admired for its ability to facilitate the transition to modern parliamentary democracy by incremental adjustment, without the need for violent revolution. The Constitution was felt to express not only a set of rules, but, more fundamentally, the values of the political nation. So it appears that contemporary difficulties come not just from an apparent desire to codify the rules, but, more profoundly, from a need to restate and rekindle the values on which the modern polity rests. One of the basic confusions arising from this debate stems from ambiguity over the meaning of the term constitution. In the history of political constitutions, some discrepancy has arisen between traditional and modern understandings. Since the British have a historic, customary, evolutionary, i.e. traditional, constitution, we should begin by considering this distinction. The traditional idea of the Constitution. Writing in 1830, the great German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel asserted that what is called making a constitution is a thing that has never happened in history. The constitution of a state, he argued, is not merely a set of institutional arrangements, but a cultural artifact that develops from the national spirit. In this traditional understanding, the Constitution expresses a nation's culture, customs, and values, as much as its system of government. The Constitution is not some dish that can be made from a recipe. It can no more be made than language is made. Like language, the Constitution evolves through usage. It expresses the ways in which we conceive ourselves as a people or a nation, or, when focusing on our governing arrangements, as a state. One of the most influential exponents of this traditional sense of the Constitution was Edmund Burke. Burke's views are most prominently expressed in Reflections on the Revolution in France, 1790, the purpose of which was to warn of the dangers of engaging in radical constitutional reconstruction in the wake of the 1789 revolution. A political constitution, Burke argued, is an entailed inheritance derived from our forefathers and transmitted to posterity. It is a liberal descent. The British respect institutions established over time and seek to improve them incrementally. But, if not entirely obsolete, they also seek to retain them. Only through such prudent and incremental reform can constitution work within the grain of social and political development and become a living reality. Burke's point is that when constitution-making is reduced to a rationalist exercise in construction, all the pleasing illusions which made power gentle and obedience liberal are dissolved. If ancient opinions and rules of life are taken away, the loss is inestimable. Lacking a compass to govern us, we cannot know in which direction to steer, and we fall into a condition of ceaseless change. Constitutional government works, he is saying, not because of the symmetry of some formal rule-based design, but by the gradual emergence of customary ways of conduct that channel the exercise of power through certain ceremonies and forms. Strip away the mystique, and you remove the behavioral constraints that make the exercise of governing power benign. Remove the sacred from the constitutional, and the whole chain and continuity of the Commonwealth is broken. Treat the state as a mechanism that can be made and remade in accordance with the floating fancies or fashions, and the very basis of political authority is lost. For Burke, the task of maintaining the Constitution requires a grasp of human nature and human necessities, together with knowledge of what facilitates or obstructs the various ends pursued by governing institutions. This practical art draws on the experience of a governing elite, acquired through traditions handed down over many generations. It is not a task to be derived from some philosophical template. The Constitution is a partnership, not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. Indeed, in this traditional understanding, the better the Constitution, the fewer the written constitutional laws, since laws only reinforce a mode of conduct that has not been fully absorbed in the manners, traditions, and practices of a people. The modern idea of the Constitution. Some might say that Hegel was wrong about making constitutions. During the summer of 1787, delegates from the 13 American states had met in Philadelphia to draft a new federal constitution for the United States. After the lapse of 6,000 years since the creation of the world, wrote James Wilson, America now presents the first instance of a people assembled to weigh deliberately and calmly, to decide leisurely and peaceably upon the form of government by which they will bind themselves and their posterity. The U.S. Constitution was the world's first modern written constitution. Its adoption opened a new era in constitutional development. Thereafter, at certain critical points in their history, nations began adopting written constitutions. The founders of the modern American Republic were conscious of making a new type of constitution. In the first of the Federalist Papers, a journalistic effort by leading framers to persuade the voters of New York to ratify the new Constitution, Alexander Hamilton observed that it was reserved to the people of this country to decide whether societies are capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they were destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. In place of the idea that the traditional constitution expressed a nation's traditions and ethical practices, Hamilton was arguing that it rested on vagaries of accident and force, on power interests rather than cultural commitments. Contrary to Burke's claim that the Constitution was an inheritance, a set of practices consecrated by custom and received by a people, Hamilton maintained it was an instrument by which the people, after reasoned debate, agreed the terms on which they are governed. Thomas Paine immediately recognized the revolutionary nature of this shift. "It is not sufficient that we adopt the word," he declaimed. "We must fix also a standard specification to it." In his Rights of Man of 1791, Paine provided the first clear statement of the modern idea of a constitution, stressing 4 key features. 1. The Constitution must have a real rather than virtual existence. It is a thing, and specifically, a document. 2. The Constitution is a thing antecedent to a government. Since it establishes the government, the Constitution cannot be made by government, but only by the people. 3. The Constitution must specify all the powers and duties of the government. It must be comprehensive. 4. The Constitution has the status of fundamental law. Being the law of lawmaking, the Constitution is a higher form of law. Since this body of constitutional law is not made by the governing institutions but by the people to establish those institutions, governments and legislatures have no authority to alter constitutional law. This modern concept of a constitution has since been adopted across the world. Nearly 200 nation-states, along with many subnational units, provinces, states, etc., in federal regimes, now have written constitutions of the modern type, documents that define and limit the powers of the institutions of government and which take effect as fundamental law. Traditional versus modern. Modern constitutions possess varying degrees of authority. It would be wrong to take the U.S. Constitution as the epitome of the modern concept. Drafted in 1787, since 1791, when the first 10 amendments were attached as the Bill of Rights, it has been amended only 17 times and is now regarded as set in stone. By contrast, the French have adopted at least 12 different constitutions since their revolution of 1789 and have experienced dictatorship, monarchy, and 5 republics. The French experience is more typical. Only a handful of national constitutions predate the Second World War, and most of the current constitutions have been newly adopted, or fundamentally amended, since 1989. This variable experience should caution against any assumption that the modern constitution has altogether replaced the traditional idea. Standards for governmental decision-making laid down in written constitutions express ideal aspirations, but often tell us little about the way power is exercised. Indeed, the Constitution might simply be a facade that masks stark realities. But even if the norms laid down in the text are fully complied with, they only regulate the office of government. Behind the shadow lies the substance. Behind government lies the state itself, the way we conceive the political unity of a people. The essential point is that the traditional and modern concepts have different objects. The modern constitution has as its object the office of government, while the traditional concept has that of the state. The modern concept distinguishes between government and society, whereas the traditional concept suggests that the manners, cultures, and traditions of a people form the real constitution of the state. Experience indicates that the task of drafting a constitution of the modern type is not so difficult. Though coming in different styles, they tend to follow a common template. The US Constitution remains a model of concision. The first article establishes a national bicameral legislature, the Congress. The second, a national executive, the President. The third, a national judicature, the Supreme Court. The fourth, the relationship with the states. The fifth, the amending procedure. The sixth, the treatment of public debt. And the seventh, and last, the procedure for ratification. But drafting and adopting such a constitution does not make it a living reality. That task lies ahead. The great challenge for a state adopting a new constitution is to ensure that its principles and values are embraced by its people. The challenge is to foster a political culture that upholds the standing of the Constitution. The case of 20th century Germany is instructive. The social democratic Weimar Constitution of 1919 failed because, in the fraught circumstances of defeat in the First World War and the removal of the monarchy, many political parties did not accept the authority of the new constitution. One of the great achievements of the German people since the Second World War, by contrast, has been to live up to the values and procedures of a federal constitution that was effectively imposed on them by the Allies. Modern constitutions serve both instrumental and symbolic purposes. As instruments of government, they establish the procedures of public decision-making. As symbolic documents, they provide a symbol of unity and identity. In their instrumental role, they are geared to the future, but in their symbolic function, they draw on the past, on heroic stories about the vicissitudes of a virtuous people. These mere scraps of paper are transformed into authoritative, almost sacred texts, only if both aspects are aligned. This suggests that the Constitution can fully realize its ambition only when it functions in harmony with the customs of the people. The Constitution of the office of government, the modern idea, must be consonant with that of the Constitution of the state, the traditional idea. The traditional constitution is invariably less precise with respect to instrumental guidance. After all, it generally draws on custom and practice rather than formally promulgated rules. But these evolving practices reflect changes in the political culture of the nation, which can radically alter the character of formal constitutional settlements. In this sense, the real Constitution of the United States, the way in which power is today legitimately exercised in practice, might be just as unwritten as that of the United Kingdom. Why doesn't Britain have a modern constitution? Since the modern concept is now so prevalent, it is widely assumed that, adhering to the traditional type, the British do not even have a constitution. This view was even being openly expressed in the 19th century. In England, the constitution may change continually, noted Tocqueville in 1835, and it therefore does not in reality exist. Why is this? The modern constitution is the product of the Enlightenment, a movement that flourished throughout Europe in the mid to late 18th century. Sometimes called the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment expressed a secular, scientific, rationalist spirit and left its mark on the arts, the sciences, religion, and politics. It also left its imprint, especially in its aspiration of freedom from arbitrary power, on both the American and French revolutions. Since the late 18th century, Modern constitutions have been adopted by many nations.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?